To those of you who've been talking to me over the last few days, I can give you a personal message of hope in that my luggage has made it to Rome. I may be reunited with it before I leave. So when we're talking about regulatory approaches to conventional arms, I'll start off hopefully briefly with some background information, and then I'll move on to some reflections which may be more interesting. So when we're talking about conventional arms, that's basically everything that isn't a weapon of mass destruction. So we're talking about everything from small arms, Kalashnikovs, through artillery, warships, combat aircraft, tanks, etc. And we see in this field, we've been talking a lot about technological innovation. There's been a lot of technological innovation in conventional arms. In particular, we've seen in the war in Ukraine has driven development of uncrewed systems, drones, as they are popularly known. So when we're talking about regulations, I can sort of give you a very brief overview in that there's a very complex multi-level web of laws, regulations, standards, norms, which apply around the world. I had some trouble with this presentation as I spent a long time trying to describe it, and then realized that this would not be a very interesting presentation. So I'll give a very brief overview at the moment. The aim of this complex multi-level web is partly to prevent illicit trafficking, to prevent organized crime, for example, getting hold of particularly military-style weapons. But it's also for national governments who are implementing most of the vast majority of the laws to have control over who gets to have weapons and who shouldn't have them. That's the sort of fundamental aim. The great majority of these laws, regulations, etc., are regulatory. So they're trying to put some standards over, as I said, who should have weapons and who shouldn't. There are also a few where there's absolute prohibitions. For example, the anti-personnel treaty banning anti-personnel landmines, or the treaty banning cluster munitions. So if we're looking at the top of this international web, we've got international humanitarian law, international human rights law. We're talking in both about acceptable and unacceptable use of weapons. I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with those, so I won't go into them any further. We've then got international treaties and agreements which focus on specific aspects of conventional arms. The Arms Trade Treaty, for example, regulates the arms trade. And here we've got prohibited end users, such as those committing war crimes, but also a requirement for risk assessment within the Arms Trade Treaty. And that the risk assessments would cover most of the arms trade. We've also got agreements, processes concerning specific weapons, what Ambassador meant about yesterday in terms of humanitarian disarmament. So there's anti-personnel landmines, 1997, small arms and light weapons, various agreements from 2001 onwards, cluster munitions, and most recently, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. In addition, we've got regional treaties and agreements, for example, within the EU, or within the Economic Community of West African States, amongst many. And sort of centrally, we've got national laws. This is where most of the activities taking place. National laws pretty much everywhere govern production, trade, ownership, etc., of weapons. So overall, key message there is there's a lot of regulation. We've got a representative from the defense industry who'll be talking later. I'm sure he can confirm this is one of the most regulated industries out there. So that's the sort of the regulatory picture. But then if we look at, okay, what's happening, we see a lot of conflict around. A conservative estimate of deaths in conflict produced by Uppsala, there was about, at least the lowest figure, about 238,000 deaths last year. We don't really know how many people killed in homicide with firearms. The best estimate we've got is from 2019, which bizarrely is almost about the same number. All of those people were killed with conventional weapons. The ballpark then, about 500,000 violent deaths a year, last year, with conventional arms. You know, that 500,000 should be shocking to us. But you know, maybe we just get used to it. So then we can say that the glass is very much half full and half empty. We could do enormously better. Humanity could be doing more to prevent the flows of weapons to those who shouldn't have them. But on the other hand, I can say you know, the situation would be a lot worse without all the regulations I mentioned. So if we talk about some overall lessons I can draw, which are relevant, I think, to a lot of the other discussions we've been having. Firstly, it is possible to make a difference. If we look back to, say, the 1980s, 1990s, specific conflicts, 25 to 40% of the victims were injured by anti-personnel landmines. There were tens of thousands of victims each year. They were viewed as inhumane because a very large proportion of those victims were civilians, sometimes years after the end of the fight. The number of deaths has been reduced enormously. Instead of them being used routinely all around the world, the last issue of the Landmine Monitor states that they were only used by two governments, that's Russia and Nepal. So we have made a huge difference there. If there hadn't been the whole process, the treaty banning those weapons, in particular banning the production and trade of the weapons, we would be seeing far more casualties, absolutely. And in terms of the earlier discussion about how do we engage with people, I mean, I've been involved in a lot of discussions on that question this year. I would say the key lesson from that campaign and other campaigns is we have to center everyday people and their stories. The victims, the people in countries affected by weapons. It's really a problem when the whole discussion gets taken over by nerds. I count myself as one of those. You know, people like me, we're the problem. Don't listen to me if you want to actually engage millions of people. So next, if we're talking about problems, though, you know, why are there so many people still having violent deaths? There's a lack of effective implementation, especially moving beyond landmines, etc., especially the arms trade treaty, small arms light weapons, etc. Attention wanes. We were talking about that earlier as well. It's a clear lesson that treaties and agreements need to be constantly reinforced and affirmed. Otherwise, they drop off the attention screen for governments. But there isn't a lot of interest in doing that. This is a problem both, I think, for civil society and for governments. You know, the new thing, the next thing on the horizon is much more interesting than trying to reaffirm and strengthen what we already have. We get bored with the familiar. We get used to high levels of death and suffering, and you know, we just see it as part of the way of the world, even though we could stop it. Also, I mean, some governments deliberately flout their obligations. They decide, well, we're just not going to assess the risks, therefore it's okay, we'll keep our eyes shut. They use arms transfers as a foreign policy tool, deliberately by non-state groups, governments involved in committing war crimes. The next, if we're talking about the current situation, again, we've been talking about that earlier. I think the global environment is becoming much more difficult for humanitarian disarmament, for regulations, restrictions on production, trade, etc., in weapons. There's a reduced space for civil society. We're seeing civil society organizations facing increased government restrictions around the world or outright bans. Also, particularly online, social media, personal attacks directed against people involved. Also, I mean, we could talk more about this later, but increased levels of global antagonism create more incentives to flout or ignore existing laws and regulations, and it makes it harder to make new agreements. Lots of ethicists, philosophers around here. I mean, all these issues around conventional weapons raise profound ethical questions, which I think haven't really been looked at very much, particularly by academics. As I said, most of the approaches are regulatory, but that implies, okay, some actions, some end users are acceptable, some aren't. But how, you know, the process of deciding, this is very difficult. Certainly weapons are used to kill and destroy. I'm sure most, or all of us perhaps around this room are sort of united by an abhorrence of warfare. But weapons are also symbols of emancipation. They're used to resist aggression. And in practice, if you're sitting in a government trying to decide whether to say, license and export, these decisions are often very complicated. And in particular, it's very common, I would say, that governments don't have enough information to actually make a good decision. But they need to make a decision. And then, therefore, we're left with problems. In my last few minutes, I think there's a need, certainly we've seen this in discussions on conventional arms, a need for some critical self-reflection amongst people who are involved in working on arms control, humanitarian disarmament, etc. I mean, it's nice to think of ourselves as the good guys, but we don't always 100% do good things. If we go back into the past, I mean, the most egregious example I can think of from the 19th century, there were European countries brought in several arms export controls focused on Africa. These were presented in humanitarian terms. But the aim was to prevent Africans from obtaining modern weapons, so it would be easier to colonize the continent. And we also see similar criticisms today that you know, a lot of what people view as controls on the trade in weapons, productions in weapons, are you know, tools by which the powerful maintain their power. I think this is a very complex issue, so it's not an argument I'm making, but it's also something that we need to reflect upon in terms of what is the outcome of what we're doing, and adds another layer of complexity. And secondly, in terms of self-reflection, there have been lots of discussions in the last few years concerning people working on campaigning and criticisms that there has been a somewhat exploitative relationship by campaigning organizations exploiting people from countries affected by war. That they're very keen on using their stories and images, but all the decisions are being made by people sitting in Western Europe, North America, who also get most of the funding. So again, I think there's a need for some sort of critical self-reflection there in terms of, even if our aims are good and rightful, are we going about things in the best way possible? Thanks very much.